Hi, I'm Stephen Stockwell. I'm in Morwell in region of Victoria. It's usually a pretty quiet place, but right now the world's eyes are on this small town because the trial of Erin Patterson has just begun, where a jury will decide, did she intend to kill her relatives with a poisoned beef Wellington lunch? Or was this all a fatal accident? Mushroom Case Daily is your eyes and ears in the courtroom. We're dropping a new episode every day with the details everyone's talking about. Will the jury find Erin Patterson guilty of murder without any suggested motive? Hit the follow button on the Mushroom Case Daily podcast. Find it in the ABC Listen app.
ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
A while back, Jamila Rizvi was on this blazing trajectory. By her mid-20s, she'd been the Chief of Staff for a federal MP. She'd written several books, won awards, appeared on TV, and she'd done plenty of public speaking. But then in 2017, Jamila realised something wasn't quite right with her health. It seemed pretty innocuous until she went in for an MRI, and she was diagnosed with an extremely rare disorder that utterly disordered her life and her state of mind after a while. Things that had once come so easily to Jamila were now a huge challenge, which she met with determination and also a sense of the ridiculous, which anyone who's been through a life-changing illness will instantly understand. Jamila and her friend Rosie Waterland have co-written a book called Broken Brains for anyone who's been sick or loved someone who was. Hi, Jamila.
Hi.
You co-wrote this book with your friend Rosie. What did you have in common? Why did you want to do this together?
Well, Rosie and I have been friends for many years. We worked together as journalists back at Mamamia in the early 2010s. And Rosie has had an incredible childhood of trauma and lives with PTSD and some pretty complex mental health challenges as a result. And she was one of the people I called when I first got diagnosed. I think because at the time for me, what I was struggling with wasn't the symptoms of what was happening with me. It was the mental health side of things. It was the shock and the realisation and the fear about what was going to come next. And I reached out to a friend who I thought would be able to help me with that. And being very pragmatic people, I went and had coffee with Rosie. She was in psychiatric care at the time. And when we were chatting, I said to her, you know, people have been really nice. Like there's 11 lasagnas in my freezer at the moment. And not to sound ungrateful. And she said, no one's ever made me a lasagna. And by the end of that lunch, we had a plan for this book. We just thought there is something fascinating in our two experiences, how similar they are in some ways and how different they are in others.
Did it take you a while to adjust to the idea of being broken?
Yeah, having a broken brain is something that my son came up with. He was two and a half when I got diagnosed. And I think when you're 2.5, something broken is the worst something can be, because when a kid falls over and, you know, they start crying because they've skinned their knee, you say, oh, well, come on, it's not broken, you're all right. So for him, for something to be broken was really bad. But importantly, I think for him, broken could also be fixed. That was something you could fix.
Something mum fixes too?
Yeah, maybe. Something people take care of you and give you a bandage and it's going to be okay. Actually, through the whole process, the thing that upset him the most was after I had a craniotomy and I came home and I had this huge bandage covering all of the staples in my head. And I had been quite nervous about how he'd react when I took the bandage off, and he saw, because it was pretty intense. I had 57 staples in my skull. I was pretty worried about how he'd react. Actually, it didn't bother him. What bothered him was the size of the bandage, because for him, like big Band-Aid for a big owie, little Band-Aid for a little owie, like that's really bad if it's a bandage that big.
Let's go back a bit. Let's go to what was going on in your life in late 2017. How are things travelling for you before you realised there might be a problem?
Life was pretty good, to be honest. I had been married not too long before. We'd had this beautiful, very unexpected pregnancy, and this little boy arrived in our lives. I'd headed back to work. I'd written my first book, and actually I was on book tour when I first started getting some symptoms. And I think life felt like it was going in the direction it should. I felt like I was busy and energised. I loved doing what I was doing. I didn't quite know what was coming next, but I was having a really good time.
And what were the first symptoms that something wasn't quite right?
The first symptoms that I noticed was that I skipped a period, which is pretty, I think, normal for a whole bunch of women. It was unusual for me, but I had been breastfeeding up until about a year before, so I sort of thought, oh, maybe things are still getting back to normal. But I went and saw my GP when I could, and I was really fortunate that she took me really seriously. I think a lot of GPs would have gone, young woman, a bit anxious, off you go.
No big deal.
Yeah. She sent me away with some blood tests and said, I want you to do these the first day your period comes back. And I waited 6 weeks and nothing happened. So I called her office. They said, just do the blood tests. And the results showed I had almost no estrogen. And I remember this shows how little I knew about health at the time. I was like, what does that mean? Am I turning into a man? And she was like, no, that's not what's happening. And she said it could be a whole range of things, but it's quite unusual. So she sent me off to an endocrinologist and a gynecologist as sort of the next stage in the process. And no one was sort of stressed. Nothing was happening quickly. I remember I had to wait 8 weeks to get into this really fancy gynecologist. I wasn't really that worried about it at that stage. Then both the endo and the gyno said, oh, we'll just do an MRI just to rule some things out that are sort of more sinister, along with a whole bunch of other tests. And then the MRI showed I had a brain tumour.
What kind of brain tumour?
So I have what's called a craniopharyngioma, which means I had to learn to spell it as well as know what it was. It's a very unusual kind of brain tumour. You're born with the cells that create a craniopharyngioma, but you wouldn't be able to see them on a brain scan of a baby. For most people, a craniopharyngioma will grow in childhood. So I'm unusual in that sense that it didn't grow until I was 31. Well, would have grown a little bit before that. I found it then. And the craniopharyngioma grows off the stalk of the pituitary gland. So you've got the brain, and then at the base of the brain is the pituitary gland. That's where all the hormones are, and the hormones are made. And it's
hence the lack of estrogen.
Indeed. And it's kind of like the conductor in the orchestra of your hormones. So the pituitary gland tells all the hormones what to do and where to go on the body. And it's connected to the brain via a little stalk. And my tumour grows right at the top of that. And so it impacts all of your hormones. It's also right next to your optic chiasm, which is where your eyesight crosses over between the two, and just below the hypothalamus, which is essential for a whole bunch of functions.
Oh, Jamila, I don't know if there's any good part of the brain you can have a tumour in, but that doesn't sound like one.
It's not a good part. It's not a good part.
How closely were you able to follow this information through the shock of what you were hearing?
I don't think closely at all. And it was a gynecologist who told us, so she didn't have a whole lot of information either. She said, you have a lesion on your brain.
A lesion? That sounds like a tear.
Yeah, I thought it sounded like a cut. I remember thinking, how'd I cut my brain? And I sort of zoned out for a bit and then asked for clarification. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, like a growth. And I sort of was like, a growth? And my husband was there and he said, like a tumour. He was following what she was saying. And I think I just went into shock. I look back on that now and I just remember fear like I've never felt before, like just incredible adrenaline and no sense of logic to my thoughts anymore. And I don't think I took in anything she said.
So a tumour?
Yeah.
But a cancerous tumour, a malignant tumour?
At that point, we didn't know. You can never really know for sure until you've got a biopsy and you can test a bit of the tumour. And she, at that point, said it could also maybe be this other thing based on the scan, but you need to see a neurosurgeon. And I remember my husband started peppering her with questions and she had to say a couple of times, I'm a gynecologist, this is not my area of specialty, because she couldn't really answer our questions.
So you went to your first neurosurgeon. How did that go, that meeting?
So we were referred to a neurosurgeon by the gynecologist and we had to wait 4 or 5 days, I think it was, which were some of the longest days of my life because we had no information. And I was trying not to Google things, but of course I was Googling things and I'm not a particularly science-minded person. I didn't really understand what I was reading, and misunderstanding can be worse because you make it even worse than it is.
And you're telling yourself this as you're Googling
exactly,
it too.
Right?
Yeah.
Exactly. And Carrie Bickmore is a friend of mine and she's obviously very well known for her work in the brain cancer space, but it did mean I knew what the odds were on brain cancers. And so I was really scared about it being a cancer. And we sat in the waiting room of this neurosurgeon. I think we were there close to 2 hours. He was running really behind that day, and there wasn't a lot of communication, but it was just 2 hours of more and more build-up. And when we walked into the room, he said, "Oh, well, you're both young, so you've probably already done all your research already, so why don't you just ask me questions?"
Right? And
yeah.
I don't think I'd know what to say if that was put to me in that situation. What did you say?
I said, "Is it cancer?" And he said, "I have no way of knowing that." And then he said, "But that's not really the point." And I was like, "What? What do you mean?" And look, 7-8 years down the track, what he was trying to say was this tumour is growing in such a densely populated part of the brain. Like there's so much going on. It's not grey matter. This is essential functions that your tumour is growing into. So it doesn't matter if it is cancerous and spreads. It's going to do damage as soon as it grows. That's what he meant, but I didn't know that at the time. And he really scared us. He really scared us. He sort of pushed that we should go quickly to remove the tumour. And he didn't say anything that I found comforting in any way.
He wanted to play 20 questions with you as well by the sound of this as well. That sounds like a really odd way to go about this. So what did you think walking out of that experience?
You know what? It never occurred to me to shop around. I mean, I had been in hospital to have a baby before for a couple of nights, and I'd had my wisdom teeth out when I was 19. Like I just had no experience of hospital systems and healthcare really, not at this level. And I think I just walked out thinking, well, this is what happens now. But we did go back to our friends who were looking after our son, and I fainted in their living room, which I don't remember, but they all do. And I remember we drove back from their place to ours, and my husband ran a stop sign, and he's an excellent driver. But that was the moment for me that really made me realise, oh wow, it's not just me. That sounds very selfish, but you're allowed to be selfish when you get told you've got a brain tumour. I suddenly went, oh God, who's going to look after him? Like, who is he going to be scared to? Who's he going to cry to? Because he can't tell me how scared he is. He's going to have to pretend he's not.
So how did you find your way to another neurosurgeon after that pretty unsatisfactory meeting?
It was pretty unsatisfactory. That very night, we had the first conversation about what would happen if I didn't survive, which was probably not a great time to have the conversation, but that's when we had it. And my husband and I were talking about our son and what life might look like for them. And I sent a text message that night to Carrie Bickmore, who's a friend, and I knew she knew what it was like, having lost her first husband, Greg, to brain cancer, to be the partner and the parent. And I said, I know you've never met Jeremy, my husband, but at some stage I wonder if you might have a coffee with him. I think he needs someone who will understand. She arrived on our doorstep within half an hour, straight from the project, in full hair and makeup, looking very glamorous, and we were sort of teary on the couch. And she cried with us and sat with us and was so kind, and then left. And not long after she left, my husband took a phone call and then went outside, which was odd. And he was outside the front of the house. And I remember thinking, oh, he must be telling someone new about what's happening with me and doesn't want me to have to hear it. And he came in and he chose his words so carefully. And he said, Carrie has called her late husband, Greg's neurosurgeon, and talked to him about what's going on with you. And he has said, you need to be very cautious with who you seek treatment from, that this is an incredibly rare tumour. And there are some surgeons, very few, but there are some surgeons who will treat a tumour like this like a trophy for the trophy cabinet. You know, it's something new, it's something different that doesn't come along very often. And you don't want that. You want someone who is careful and studied and calm, and that he could provide some other names. And if we wanted to talk to him, we were welcome to.
That's extraordinary advice.
Yeah.
And it's the kind of advice that has the undertone, please listen very carefully to this. Were you listening very carefully at that point? Yeah,
I really was. And I think because I had had a difficult emotional experience with this guy, which the emotional experience doesn't mean he wouldn't have been a great surgeon, but for me that confirmed I have not got the right person. I need to see someone else.
So you found your way to a new neurosurgeon.
Yeah.
How was neurosurgeon number 2? Was that a bit better experience for you?
Yeah, I don't think it could have been better. He agreed to see us at 7 a.m. before his other patients on Monday morning. I don't remember too much about that conversation, but I remember him saying to me, this is extremely serious and you're going to have to be really strong, but we're going to get you through this. And I held on to him saying, we're going to get you through this like a life raft. I think I'm probably still holding on to it.
What did he say about the rareness of this tumour?
He said it affected between every 1 million and every 1.5 million people. This is pretty unusual.
What do you think when you hear something like that?
You don't feel special, that's for sure. Like it's not like you feel like, oh, look at me, I'm remarkable.
Not special in a good way.
No, absolutely not. And I mean, what it means is that no one's got a lot of experience with it. That's the reality. And you want experienced surgeons. And he was very honest with me. He said that he had seen an operation on one of these in his early days as a resident, and he had conducted 1 or 2 himself later in life. But that for someone that does 2 or 3 brain surgeries a week and was in his 60s, he hadn't seen many, but he had some experience.
So this tumour is there and it's growing. Does it metastasize? Is it cancer or not? What's the nature of this actual tumour that you have?
Yeah, so mine is not cancerous, it's benign, which is such an odd word for something that does a lot of damage.
Yeah.
But it can be cancerous and it can become cancerous, but that's very, very unusual. Unusual on top of unusual. For me, the challenge is what it hits. And so it was already cutting off blood supply to my hormones. That's why I had no estrogen. And the surgery could mean that I lost more hormone function. It was also pressing against and had sort of stuck itself to my optic chiasm, which mean removing all of it was going to affect my eyesight. And it was moving up towards my hypothalamus, which could have caused more damage as well.
It sounds like it had been with you all your life. Had it been growing slowly, bit by bit, incrementally since you were born?
They don't think so. So for a totally unrelated reason where I ended up being fine, I had an MRI I think it was about 6 years before we found the tumour, and there's no evidence on that scan. So it would have been there since I was born. There would have been some cells there because that's how it grows, but it wasn't visible on a scan, which means it probably had grown in the last few years. And because I had this little boy and I had been breastfeeding, my son Ruffy quit breastfeeding. Like he just quit overnight when he was about 11 months. That morning it was fine, and that night he was whacking me away like he didn't want breast milk. And he would happily take breast milk I'd pumped earlier from a bottle, but then he wouldn't take fresh breast milk from a bottle. And when I've told that to doctors, we have no way of knowing for sure, but it's very likely that my breastfeeding hormone, because there's a breast milk hormone called prolactin, that was starting to change around the time he was 11, 12 months. So he knew before all of us.
So you decided to publicly announce your condition by going on the project with your friend Carrie. Why did you want to do that?
It was pragmatic, I think. I'm not someone who's ever felt particularly private about my illness. I've not felt ashamed about having been sick. A lot of people talk about how hard it is to accept help from friends and family. I wanted lots of help. I was like, guys, this is really bad and everyone should help me. And I also had this job at the time. I was freelancing as a journalist. I was doing some writing, some TV, some podcasting. And I know that in the media, being well known and having a name that people recognise and being seen on television and the like, that is your currency. And I knew that if I was going to disappear for up to 6 months, I was going to really go backwards in my career and I wouldn't know what I was coming back to. And so I felt like I should say something. The other reason was that I did go looking for stories when I was diagnosed. I went looking for stories of people who were unwell. And all the stories about people being sick are told at the end. And they're either glorious, triumphant stories or sad, mournful stories about someone who's died. And I couldn't find stories of people in the middle of it who were like, I'm in this and I don't know what's going to happen. And so I think I also felt like it was important to put out there what it feels like when it's happening.
That's such a great insight. I think people around you want certainty about whatever it is that's going to happen or go on, even more than you do.
Yeah, I think they need that from you. And I remember someone close to me saying, very tearily at one point, I just need you to tell me that you're going to be okay. And I look back on that now and think, no, that's not how it works. You don't get to put that on. You don't get to put that on me. And there's this great theory called ring theory, which sort of is a series of concentric circles. And in the center of the middle circle is the person who something is happening to. In this case, serious illness. And then around me is my husband and my son. Around them, the next circle out is, I don't know, my mum and dad and my sister. Around them are my best friends. And you go out and out and out till you get to, I don't know, our postman, who I chat to some days, right? And the theory of ring theory is that your grief has to go out. You can dump on we all need to dump when things are really hard like this. We need to be able to cry to someone and to freak out. But you do that outwards. You do that to someone on a circle outside of you, and your support goes in. Your support and confidence goes in. And I think that was an example with that loved one of they were panicking and they put the grief and the fear inwards rather than outwards, because I wasn't equipped to deal with that.
When you look back on that footage of you on the project now, having gone through everything you've gone through, what does that pre-operation Jamila look like to you when you see her on the telly? Is she a different person?
Yeah, I think so. I was so scared. And in the same way, I think it's difficult for people to describe where grief ends and depression starts. It's difficult for me to describe where the fear ended and anxiety began. But I do think I was quite mentally unwell in that period waiting for that first surgery. My adrenaline was so high for so long, I almost couldn't give myself a break. And I can see that fear, and I can see how I'm trying on the project to appear calm. And I was the opposite. But I also look at her and I think, you were so naive. I just thought the worst thing that was going to happen to me was the surgery, and it was scary. But as long as I survived that, then bad thing happened and have a bit of recovery, and then I just go back to normal.
Going into the surgery, you preparing yourself for not coming out of it? Did you have that conversation with yourself or other people?
I did. I don't think I was even preparing myself. I thought that was what was going to happen. I had utterly convinced myself I wasn't going to survive that surgery. And that first surgery, there are risks. There's no neurosurgery without risks, but I had very good chances of coming through that surgery. But I just couldn't believe it. I genuinely was so scared. And I recorded letters to my husband and to my son, and I gave them to one of my dear friends to look after for afterwards. I talked to her about what I wanted for my son because I knew my husband wasn't up for the conversation. I think he couldn't bear it at that point. And also he was a bit more rational and was like, no, this surgery is really scary, but you were going to survive the surgery. This whole ordeal is a different question, but the surgery, we will see you afterwards. With my first brain surgery, they accessed my tumour via my nose. Because my tumour grows right at the bottom of the brain, the easiest way to get to it is actually up through your nose to cut a piece of skull out and then to go in through there, which, like from a scientific perspective, the fact that they can put cameras in through your nose to look at your brain and do an operation is ridiculous, right? We live in the future,
I know.
Guys.
We live in the future. Hooray for science, yeah.
Yeah, it's extraordinary, and it is lower impact than a craniotomy.
Do you remember coming out of it?
Not really. I was on a lot of drugs. I have snatches of time. I definitely remember at one point being lifted up by people and put on something cold, which I'm guessing was a machine that was scanning my brain in some way. And I remember just the sheer pain in my head. And I also remember one of the hormones that you have that's produced is related to your thirst mechanism. And for a period after that first surgery, mine got a bit disrupted, which meant that they had to leave me without medication to see if it was going to come back before treating me. So the feeling is of like unrelenting thirst, like you've been in the desert for 10 weeks and there's no water. And it was, I can't tell you how awful it was. Like I was so thirsty, and they couldn't give me more than 2 litres in 24 hours to be able to do the tests they had to do. But I was also coming in and out with memory. So my poor husband and sister, I would sort of fall asleep for 10 minutes, wake up and say, can I have water? And they'd have to explain that I couldn't. And I'd be like, I'm so thirsty. I have to. And they'd explain it. I'd kind of fall asleep again, wake up and then go, why can't I have any water? And they just had to keep having this conversation again and again. But I can still feel that thirst, even though it was so soon after surgery. I remember what that was like, being denied water when I was just desperate.
So it was like a slow resurfacing.
I think I was pretty much fully conscious within a few days. I remember watching the finals of the Australian Open because that was what was on television in the neurosurgery ward in January. I was a bit swollen and I looked, very bashed around, and there's a lot of stuff coming out of my nose, and I had a lot of padding inside my nose. But I think if you'd seen me on the street 3 weeks later, you wouldn't have known what had happened to me, other than I was very pale and walking slowly.
How was your husband Jeremy able to help you through this period?
I remember my mum said Jeremy was worth marrying just for the 3 weeks after you got the diagnosis. And it's true. It really was. It really was. He was steely. I think he figured out very quickly that what I needed, and it's not what everyone needs, but what I needed was unwavering confidence that I was going to be okay. I didn't need someone, at least from him, to sort of sit there and feel uncertain with me. I needed someone who said, no, stop it. This is going to be fine, because I really took a lot of faith from that. And that's certainly not what everyone needs, but it's what I needed. And other than that one moment I told you about, I don't think I saw him waver for years.
I think I heard you say when you were diagnosed, one of the first thoughts that came to you was, is he going to be all right?
Yeah. I was really worried about him. I was worried about my son. I remember being really worried it was hereditary, which it's not. That was one of the things I panicked about early on. I really worried about him and my son. They were the two people I was most scared about. But it's been really tough on my husband. Like, it's scary to be young and starting life and have a new baby and be wondering what on earth is going to happen to your wife.
Podcast and broadcast. This is Conversations with Richard Fidler.
Then there had to be a second round of brain surgery. What was the need for this?
It was such a shock. We weren't that far past it. I think my formal recovery ended in March. We had a big party in May to celebrate the tumour being gone. It was RuPaul Drag Race theme. We all dressed up as drag queens. It was the best. And then my husband and I bought a house in May as well. Bought our first home.
Oh, man, that's insane. Oh, that's crazy doing that at that time.
I know.
Right. Anyway.
But we were desperate. Anyway, we got there.
Yeah.
We moved into the house on the Saturday. We were unpacking on the Sunday. And on the Monday, they told me it had grown back, which means that my parents had to unpack the house and everything's in the wrong spot still. Sorry, I'm trying to make jokes about the grim times. And they had told me it had grown back much quicker than expected.
And like to a similar size or?
Yeah, it had grown back quite aggressively. Like, it was growing much faster than it had grown to that point. I don't know. I think about it like when you prune plants and then they grow better. I don't know. Clearly, I don't know what I'm talking about, everyone. But it had grown back very quickly and it was worse than they thought. And because of the direction it was growing, they wanted to do a craniotomy and access the point in the brain in a different spot. So essentially what they wanted to do was to cut a hole to the right-hand side of my right eye and just sort of close to the temple and remove a piece of skull, go in through there and then essentially like lever up the brain to be able to go underneath it to get to the bottom.
This was all explained to you before or after the operation?
It was explained before. My brain surgeon was, and I liked this, very straightforward, very direct and to the point and didn't sugarcoat things. And I really liked that. And that wouldn't have suited everyone, but it suited me because I felt like he wouldn't lie to me. And I was less scared going in the second time. It sounds really silly, but in my head I thought, well, I've done this once, so that means I can do it again. Noting that I didn't have to do anything. I was going to be asleep. I was scared, but I did feel more confident second time around. Ahead
of the surgery, your sister came to be with you. Why was that a problem?
Well, the first time I had surgery, I was in this lovely double room and my husband was allowed to stay the night before and I was so well supported. And then the second time I was in a shared room and we were at a very strict hospital that said under no circumstances could anyone stay after visiting hours were over. And I just panicked because I just assumed someone could stay with me because my husband stayed the first time and we'd arranged for my sister to stay the second and I just panicked. And they were very firm though. They were like, absolutely not. No one stays in the neurosurgery ward after 10 p.m. And my sister just said, don't worry, I've got this. And she hid. She hid in multiple different places around the hospital through the night.
Closets?
Yeah, she hid in linen closets. She went to the bathroom at very important specific times. She would go into other people's rooms. She said she tried not to look at people and betray their privacy. She even went under the hospital bed at one point. It meant that she stayed the whole night and she got away with it. I don't know if they knew and were like, this crazy lady will just let her stay. She did get caught at one point and she said, yeah, I'm just going. And I woke up at about, I can't believe I slept, but I did sleep. And I woke up at around 5 a.m. and she was sitting on the chair beside me just covered in coats. And she sort of peeked her head out and went, yeah, just gave me a thumbs up, like, did it.
So after the second craniotomy,
yes,
what were you told coming out of that?
It wasn't so much what I was told. I think it was what others were told. So when I was still out, when they got in there, it was much worse than they thought. It was worse than they'd seen on the scan. And so they made the decision to be more aggressive than they previously had. Previously, they deliberately left bits in there to preserve brain function.
What a bastard of a thing.
Yeah.
Come roaring back like that.
I know, right?
And nastier with it this time. I know you shouldn't, project human things onto it, but
oh, yeah.
How do you think about the tumour? Do you call it the bastard or something like that, or do you have a name for it?
Rosie named it. We call it Jam's jerky. Because we imagine that's what it looks like, a bit like beef jerky, and it's a jerk because he's growing back. That's the best we've got.
So how did the surgery go, though, the second time round?
I have had surgeons who, the sort of the assistant surgeons who were there telling me that a lesser surgeon would not have been able to do what my brain surgeon did. They got almost all of it. They left a very small piece attached directly to my optic chiasm because I would have gone blind if they'd taken that. But nonetheless, there was a decent risk I'd lost a lot of eyesight, if not all of it. And so my husband and my sister were told to prepare themselves for how they would tell me that, because if you wake up from brain surgery and you can't see, you're going to panic. And so they essentially said to them, you need to be ready for how you're going to speak to her because you're going to have to help calm her down if she can't say anything.
But you could see.
I could. I couldn't see everything. I'd lost, at that stage, quite a bit came back, but I'd lost a lot of my peripheral vision. So I'd lost about 30 degrees on one side and about 50 on the other. And so I did panic when I woke up because I couldn't see properly. But apparently what I said was, Jez, I can't see properly. And the fact that I knew my husband was right in front of me meant they all knew that I could see. So they were all so relieved and I was panicked. So it was a real mismatch of emotions when I first woke up. But apparently my husband, during those few hours while they were preparing, had done an enormous amount of research about how we were going to change the whole house around to cater to his newly blind wife. He'd looked into how to learn to read Braille because he knew I'd want to learn to read. He was being, as always, very, very practical and very, very prepared.
So post-op, this meant prolonged rounds of radiation therapy. How many weeks was that?
Actually took a little while for that to happen. I came out of that one and we thought we were good, and I had lost a lot of hormone function, which I had to start adjusting to, including some pretty significant permanent disabilities. And then it was about 5 months later, it started growing again.
What kind of permanent disabilities, Jamila?
So if I round them all up together, they all came slowly, really. A bunch came after the craniotomy, more came after radiation, but now I pretty much have no blood supply to my pituitary gland, so all of the hormones that are made there don't work anymore. So I don't have prolactin or estrogen or testosterone or growth hormone or a bunch of others that sit in there. I can't remember them all now. I don't have that water balance hormone that made me so thirsty when I briefly didn't have it earlier. And most fundamentally is that I don't make cortisol anymore. And cortisol is often called the stress hormone. And if you spend any time on TikTok or Instagram, they spend all their time telling you how to keep your cortisol low so that you won't gain weight. And it's a real sort of diet fad at the moment. Really low cortisol is also bad, and I don't have any. So I have to guard against having too little cortisol. So I take cortisol synthetically. I take a tablet every day, but I have to be ready to judge how much stress my body will incur during that day, because if I have an unusual amount of stress, physical or emotional, I need more cortisol. Otherwise my blood pressure drops and I can have what's called an adrenal crisis, which can be fatal.
So you really have to attend to your well-being
very
carefully on a daily basis. You're still a young woman. One of the best things about being young is not having to attend to that stuff.
Yeah, 100%. I have boxes of tablets that remind me of the boxes I remember my grandmother having when I was a kid and thinking, oh, wow, she's got to take so many things every day. I take way more than she ever did. You know, I start the morning with 4 or 5 tablets. I have more in the evening, and then I have gels and creams and injections in between. It takes a lot of work to keep me alive.
So what was the reason for radiation therapy to kick in after that? Was more growth discovered?
So there was this tiny little bit of tumour left, and it grew a cyst, just to, again, be a jerk. And again, it doesn't matter if it's a tumour or a cyst. If it's growing in your brain, it's going to hit stuff and do bad things. So I had radiation therapy after that, 6 days a week for 6 weeks, which I was just so relieved by because it wasn't surgery, but it was undeniably pretty tough. And the thing about radiation is that it remains active for a couple of years in the body with the intention of killing whatever we've put it in there to kill. But for me, that meant that it seems to have successfully acted on the tumour. The tumour's shrunk. It's about the size of half a grain of rice now, and it hasn't changed since it hit that size. But it also took with it more function, including a lot of my really, really impacted my memory.
The nature of radiotherapy like that is that it's kind of fine for the first couple of weeks, maybe even as far as 4 weeks, then it really starts to get quite nasty after that. But in the early stages, you write that you felt well enough to having some friends over for dinner. What were you going to cook for your friends over at this marvellous dinner?
It was such a good night. I had sent Jeremy, my husband, and my son Ruffy down the beach for the weekend. I was like, I'm fine. I'm this magical, brave woman who is not affected by radiation, it seems, which is not true. And I had some mates over for dinner, and I had this grand meal planned, and I burnt everything except one thing, which was this jalapeno cornbread. It was the one thing I didn't ruin. So we ended up having cornbread and popcorn for dinner because I ruined everything else.
That doesn't sound too bad.
But it was lovely. It wasn't that bad. It was so lovely. It was just, I felt normal. It was a rare night feeling normal, I think.
And how did the night go?
Well, the night was excellent until everyone headed home, and I was sort of doing the washing up and, you know, doing that thing where you reflect on how nice the night was. And my palms started to burn is the best description I've got. Honestly, it felt, when I was on schoolies as a teenager, I had accidentally put my hand on a hot plate that was still hot. It felt like that. It felt like I had my palms were burning, like I was actively burning them. It was horrendous. And it came out of nowhere, and I couldn't stop it. I put them in ice. I ran them under cold taps, and I was doing that thing where you spiral, but you're trying to find solutions, right? And I kept going, the radiation's in my brain, not my hands. Why are my hands being affected? And I couldn't figure out what was going on. I was running through all the things they told us before radiation, and I was calling my husband, but he didn't answer. It was after midnight. He was asleep. I called a couple of my friends who had been for dinner, but it was a good hour and a half later. They were home and was clearly asleep as well. And after about half an hour, I was like, I'm just going to have to go to the hospital because who knows what's happening. And I couldn't figure out how the radiation was causing the burning in my palms, and so I had no idea of knowing how serious it was.
How did you get to the hospital?
Uber. I called an Uber, and I had the loveliest Uber driver. I wish I remembered his name. He was so sweet. When he figured out what was going on, he offered to stay with me. He really didn't want to leave. And I was like, no, that's really weird. You should go. The one good thing is that when you go to emergency at midnight and you're in the middle of radiation for a brain tumour and your hands are burning, you get triaged real fast.
And what did they tell you? What was wrong?
We did tests all night. I had this incredible emergency resident who was so thorough, and we did there are all these usual brain tests that you do, and I know them all, but we'd done blood tests, we'd done urine tests, we'd done all of the reflex tests, we'd checked this and that. And
your hands are still burning?
Still burning. It did start to kind of wear off a little around 5, 6 a.m.
But it's not right. Your hands shouldn't be burning.
No, and it just wouldn't stop though. And he was exhausted. By the time it was sort of 6 a.m, we were both like, what's wrong? And I'd calmed down by then because we'd ruled out all the horrible stuff by that point. Because through all the tests, it was just this weird mystery, like I was on an episode of House. And he finally said, what did you eat again? Tell me what you ate. And I ran through it, and he said, and you cooked? And I said, yes. And he said, do you cook with chilies a lot? And I was like, yeah, all the time. Like, my family's Indian. Chilies and everything. And he paused and went, do you cook with jalapenos a lot? And I was like, oh, no, I've never cooked with them before. And he was like, right, you have a skin allergy to jalapenos. And I was like, oh, what do I do? And he was like, well, I would wear gloves next time you make cornbread. And I, like, honestly, never felt so stupid.
How long did it take you to own up to your husband about that night?
Well, he had all these missed calls, right?
So he had to be told.
Yeah,
right.
So he had to be told. But he was like, I think he was just tired by that point, just tired and frustrated.
Now, as I said, radiation therapy takes its toll.
Yeah.
And this cumulative, debilitating effect of it can be explained by something called spoon theory. Can you explain what spoon theory is, Jamila?
So this is a story of a woman who was with her friends. She lived with chronic illness, very serious chronic illness, and she had this group of friends over for a dinner party, hopefully not cornbread, and she was trying to explain to them what it's like to be someone who the limit of your energy or your ability day by day is hard to predict, that sometimes it's pretty good and sometimes it's awful, and you don't know when that's going to be the case. And she went and she got all the spoons from her kitchen cabinet, and she said, we all know what it was like when you were 18 and you could go out and you could have a night on the booze and you wake up the next morning and you just go to university or do whatever, right? You just seem to recover. You had this sort of endless energy. And then once you get to your 40s or older, you're like, oh, God, remember that? Remember having energy? And she said, for me, when you were 18, you had endless spoons. You just had all the spoons. You could just use them up however you wanted. As you get older, you have a few less spoons. She said, for me, I have very few spoons and I never quite know where the limit is. And I have to be really, really deliberate about how I use my spoons. So on a bad day, if it's going to take one spoon to get up and have a shower, maybe the shower's not worth it. If it's going to take 5 spoons to go into the city and meet a friend for lunch, even though I sort of seem kind of okay and I could chat on the phone, the trip isn't worth it because to get into the city, I'm going to use up 5 of my spoons and then I don't have enough to put my kid to bed. And I found it such a useful way of thinking about things. And during radiation treatment, as it accumulated, I did have fewer and fewer and fewer spoons. And I have far more today, but I still, this many years on, have days where I have 2 spoons and I have no choice because my blood pressure's gotten so low. I'm really only functional if I'm horizontal, not vertical.
Given that you're a super driven woman, Jamila, does knowing that help you forgive yourself for not having enough spoons in the drawer?
Not at all.
No?
I try. I really try. I'm working really hard at that. But no, I think it's the thing I find hardest to accept is that I went through some really hard things that were relentless for a couple of years. And I'm a Melbourneian. I came out of that in 2018 and 2019 and went straight into lockdown for 2 years. And life's still hard and I just don't want it to be like that. And I hate being unpredictable. I hate letting people down. You know, I'm the person, like I was here at the ABC. You guys said to be 15 minutes early. I made sure I was 40 minutes early just in case because you never know. Like I'm that person. I am organised and deliberate and I like to be reliable. And I'm not reliable anymore because I can't be because I can't do things some days. I hate how unpredictable it is. I hate that sometimes I'm on television now and because of my memory I can't remember the name of the treasurer that day. You know, I'm trying, I'm better than I was. I'm trying to accept it, but I've really struggled with accepting new limits.
How has it affected your memory?
So I have what's called retrograde amnesia, which means that my memory from before radiation is fine and my memory after radiation is affected. And it's the ability to form mostly short-term memories. I have the kind of memory loss that everyone has a little bit of, the kind of things where you're like, oh, I met that guy today. What's his name? What's his name? I have that, but I just have way more of it. Sometimes I will forget whole stories of things that have happened to me. My husband will be telling a story and then go, it didn't happen to me. It happened to Jam, and sort of throw to me to continue telling my story. And I can't remember my story. You know, we now have this thing where I'll give him a look of panic and he'll go, she doesn't remember what happened. I will tell the story. Humans, we are made up of our memories, right? That's who we are. It's what's happened to us and what we've experienced. And it is difficult when you realise that there are whole experiences I don't hold anymore.
You mentioned that the near absence of cortisol can result in all kinds of weight issues. And this is what led you to develop an eating disorder. You write about this very openly. What can you tell me about that period?
Yeah, so you replace cortisol with steroids, and anyone who's been on steroid medication knows it's not very nice to you.
No, you get aggressive and cranky.
You get very angry, and it puffs up your face and neck, and often you will become very, very hungry and gain quite a bit of weight. I also have damage to my hypothalamus, which controls your hunger. And hypothalamic damage, it's sometimes called hypothalamic obesity, can cause you to gain a lot of weight very, very fast. And so this hypothalamic damage can be horrific. And there's, until extremely recently, like this year, there has been no treatment for it that is effective. And so you have these little kids whose parents tell stories of putting locks, like with bolts, on the fridge and the cupboard at night because their kids will get up because they're so desperate for food. I didn't realise this was happening at the start, but I gained a lot of weight very, very quickly. I don't like to talk in numbers because that's not helpful for people, but I gained about a third of my original body weight within about 6 months. And I really struggled with how to manage the ferocious hunger that you experience with hypothalamic damage, which just means you're never satiated. I remember going out to dinner to celebrate something one night with my husband, and we really went over the top, and we went to some fancy restaurant. We had this 12-course degustation. Like, we couldn't breathe when we left. We'd had so much food. And we got home and I went to the cupboard for a snack, and Jez was like, "What is going on?" And I was like, I'm hungry. And so I sort of had to learn to deny my own hunger because like for my own physical health reasons, and from forcing myself to not eat when I was starving, I just sort of, I think I like controlled my way into an eating disorder. And it actually took a long time for me to accept that I was anorexic, because I didn't look anorexic, right? Because hypothalamic damage causes your body to hold anything it eats, it stores as fat. And so even eating very, very little, I was only holding myself at this much higher weight. And so when that was sort of first put to me by doctors, I was like, what are you talking about? I'm just doing what I have to do to manage this condition I now have. But I look back now at a good probably 3 or 4 years and think, no, you were behaving exactly the way an eating disorder patient does, with the same shame, the same anger, the same hiding of food. I became obsessed with baking. Baking and cooking is something a lot of people with eating disorders will become obsessed with because it gives you proximity to food without eating that food. You're around the smells and you're connected to it. And I became obsessed, like way of being close to something sweet, because I wouldn't let myself eat anything sweet.
So part of you has got this voice in your head saying, I'm very hungry and I need food right now.
Yeah.
I can tell I have no actual physical need for food.
Yeah.
And then another part of your head knows that this is all a result of the strange neurochemical mess that's been left in my head as a result of all this.
Yeah.
You would feel like you were going crazy, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I did. And I was so angry because I was so hungry. I was just permanently hangry, which was probably life at home with me was probably pretty rough. Our society is not kind to people in different body shapes, and I experienced that loss of power that I think women often experience as they age. Our society values women for how they look so often, and I was still quite a young woman, but I was experiencing that loss of power, and I didn't like it, and I was trying to control my way into a better place, but it wasn't actually possible. My brain wasn't going to allow that to happen.
How did you find your way out of this?
A lot of therapy. I think that's the best answer is therapy.
Have you found your way out?
Yes. I worked with a eating disorders health at any size specialist for 2 years who was incredible at helping me shift my thinking. I also worked with an exercise physiologist who was incredibly compassionate and really focused on me using exercise for my health and wellness rather than thinking, oh, exercise might make me thin. He was really good at saying, no, we're going to focus on getting strong, and we're going to look at the side effects of your medication and go, how can we combat that through exercise and through strength training? And he helped me just think about it a bit differently. And then it was about a year ago I was able to access a medication that is relatively new, which is not specifically for my tumour but is adjacent in terms of the impact. But there is a lot of research at the moment going into weight loss drugs because of the success of things like Ozempic. It's very popular. But the research dollars don't come from weight loss research. They come from research into conditions like mine that otherwise would not get funded. They're only getting funded because there's such popularity of these drugs being used by people who don't have a condition like mine for weight loss. So I feel conflicted about them, but the reality is that since going onto this drug the last little while, I have doubled the amount of food I eat every day. And so I am eating enough and have had the bizarre experience of losing most of the weight at the same time.
How are you doing at the moment?
Pretty good in that sense. Mostly because I felt pretty bad for a really long time. I feel better than I have for years. I feel stronger and fitter, and that helps with a sense of strength against the threat of tumour growth, right? Like I feel healthy. So I feel like if something went wrong, I am in a place to manage this. Whereas, all my treatment early on, I barely had time to recover before I had to do another thing. And life, I think, feels more normal and more like I wanted it to look than I ever thought was going to be possible again. It will never look the way I wanted it to, but it's closer.
Jamila, you really hope that coming out of an ordeal like this, that there'd be some hard-fought wisdom that would arrive? Or is that just too trite? I don't know. Have you changed, do you think, in your mind about sort of things? I don't mean physically, but in the way you see life, given that life is so much more contingent now. Do you see the world differently? Do you see people differently? Or has it just reinforced your ideas of what life in this world is about?
I remember being asked why I wasn't one of those people who, when they get a horrible diagnosis, like quits their job and goes around the world or moves to a desert island or changes everything. I've never met
anyone who's ever done that, by the way.
I do think because most of us, if we are reasonably happy before we're unwell, you just want to live that life. That's all I wanted. I didn't want to change things. I just wanted to be alive to live that life. I wanted to watch Ruffy grow up. I wanted to be Jez's wife. I wanted to keep doing interesting work. I wanted to hang out with my mates. This is all I wanted to do. I didn't want anything else. And I got that. And so I do think I've changed a little bit. I think I'm probably a bit more willing to give people the benefit of the doubt because I have more of a sense of who knows what's going on for you right now. I'm less afraid of death. I'm still very afraid of early death or premature death, but I'm less afraid of dying because my focus has moved to wanting to be alive and wanting to live this life. And I'm scared I won't get to do that, but I feel increasingly confident.
It's been amazing speaking with you, Jamila. Thank you so much for sharing this extraordinary story with us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's honestly been a pleasure.
Jamila Rizvi's book, co-written with her friend Rosie Waterland, is called Broken Brains, for anyone who's been sick or loved someone who was.
This is Conversations with Richard Fidler.
Today's conversation was created on the lands of the Gadigal people. Producer is Alice Moldovan. Executive producer is Nicola Harrison. I'm Richard Fidler. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations. For more Conversations interviews, please go to the website abc.net.au/conversations.